right, we are going to go ahead and cover chapter 16, which is the digestive system. So our digestive system has a variety of functions. So it's a complex set of organs, glands, and ducts that all work together with the end goal of transforming our food and liquids into nutrients for our cells. So it starts with intake, where we then begin to digest it or break it down into smaller and smaller particles. A lot of this is done by enzymes. And eventually, we can break it into small enough building blocks that are usable, which we can absorb and transport throughout the body, primarily via our bloodstream. So the first step is ingestion and mastication, which means chewing. So ingestion is when we consume either liquids or solids. As I said, mastication is chewing. So that would be considered physical digestion. So we'll talk a lot about enzymes that play a role in the chemical digestive process, but chewing is our first step of digestion in a physical digestion, or breaking food into smaller pieces. Our digestive system is also responsible for propulsion and mixing. So propulsion meaning moving food through the digestive tract through waves of smooth muscle contraction known as peristalsis. And then we also mix food with other materials, especially in an area like the stomach, where we're going to mix it with gastric juices. So digestion, as we said, includes mechanical and chemical breakdowns, and we're going from larger molecules to smaller molecules that can actually be absorbed and used by the body. We also secrete certain liquids, enzymes, and mucus to combine with our ingested food. Absorption is when we're actually going to absorb those nutrients into our blood, or some nutrients like fats are going to go through our lymphatic system. And then actual elimination is when we're removing those undigested materials like fiber and other waste products as feces. So here's a map of our entire digestive system. So this includes both our primary and accessory organs. And so the main difference here is that our primary organs are going to be the ones that actually come into contact with the food. So that's our digestive tract or alimentary canal, whereas our accessory organs, they have enzymes, materials that are related to and help with digestion, but they're not going to come into contact with the food itself. So that is pretty much what I just said, is that we have our actual digestive tract, which has our primary organs, and then we have a few associated organs that help with digestion. The digestive tract is also called the gastrointestinal tract, or you may see the term alimentary canal with an A. And so our tract ends up being one long tube from mouth all the way to the anus. So the digestive tract itself starts with our oral cavity or mouth. Remember, the pharynx is our one organ that is going to be part of both the respiratory and digestive system. This time, instead of hitting the larynx and trachea, we're going to go from the pharynx to the esophagus. So our esophagus is where we're going to carry our food. The stomach, thank you. The stomach is where we'll get our mixing of food and gastric juices. So that includes stomach acid and some of the enzymes that are introduced in the stomach. The small intestine is where a majority of absorption takes place. So anytime you hear absorption, you should think small intestine. And then our large intestine is how we move wastes to the rectum and anus. And our large intestine also reabsorbs a lot of water from the waste and feces. Here's our list of associated organs. So these are not directly in that digestive tract, but they're going to have ducts that lead to the digestive tract so that they're able to contribute their secretions to the digestive process. Our salivary glands are going to empty into the oral cavity. We have the liver, which produces bile, the gallbladder, which stores that bile, and then we have the pancreas, which is going to be responsible for some digestive enzymes and also our hormones that control blood sugar. The wall of the digestive tract is made up of four layers or four tunics. The innermost layer is the mucosa, and its main job is just to secrete mucus so that we can continue to move material through the digestive tract. The submucosa is just superficial to the mucosa. It's where our blood, vessels, nerves, and small glands are located. And if you remember back from the nervous system chapter, we have our enteric nervous system, which supplies our digestive tract. The muscularis does exactly what it sounds like. It has muscles, and there's actually a few layers within the muscularis. We have a longitudinal, a circular, and in some areas, an oblique layer. And then finally, we have our outermost layer, the serosa or adventitia. It's, like I said, the outermost, it's mainly there for protection. When we have a peritoneum present, or the peritoneal membrane is present, we call this the serosa. In the areas that don't have the peritoneum, this is when we call it the adventitia. So that's why both are listed there. That's our distinction. This just shows kind of the breakdown of those layers there. So a good review slide. All right, so getting to the peritoneum. So this is what lines our abdominopelvic cavity and mainly the abdominal cavity. Just like any other serous membrane, remember it's going to have two layers to it. So we have our visceral layer, in this case, the visceral peritoneum. This is when we're going to call it the serosa, and it covers the organs of our digestive tract and abdominal cavity. The parietal peritoneum is that outer part of the membrane, and that's going to line the wall of the abdominal cavity. Mesenteries are the term for just big sheets of connective tissue and fatty tissue, and they're there to help hold the organs in place within our abdominal cavity. So we have the lesser omentum and the greater omentum are the two mesenteries that we discuss. And so the lesser omentum runs from our lesser curvature of the stomach down to the liver and diaphragm. And then our greater omentum is kind of like an apron that runs all the way from the greater curvature of the stomach down to the transverse colon and actually connects to the posterior part of our abdominal cavity or the posterior body wall. So this is if we were to take a sagittal plane or sagittal cut through half the body. So if you look in, we have all these different organs around, and the omentum is this blue kind of dot structure. And so this is just fatty tissue and connective tissue that kind of fills in the space between our organs there. So it helps protect them and it helps them maintain their space in the abdominal cavity. All right, so going back up to the start of our digestive tract, we have the oral cavity. So our lips are actually muscular structures. They're formed by our orbicularis oris muscle and then obviously covered by some skin, but they're primarily muscle. We have our cheeks that are the lateral walls and border of our oral cavity, and our buccinator muscles are some of our powerful chewing muscles. We have our buccinator and our masseter, which are going to help flatten the cheeks against our teeth and help us with chewing. Our tongue, again, is a large muscle. Of course, it occupies a large majority of our oral cavity. And so it's there to help move food in the mouth, and it actually helps us hold food in place so that we can chew it. We don't necessarily think about holding food with our tongue, but between the tongue, the lips, and the cheeks, they kind of work together to make sure that we can chew up our food. So you'll notice we have a few different types of teeth. As humans, we have a wide variety of foods in our diet. So we have teeth that are designed to cut or tear food, and we also have some flatter teeth that are designed to crush food and plants. The hard palate is a little bit more anterior. Then you can put your tongue right on kind of the roof of that. And then our soft palate is behind there. We have our uvula, which is hanging down here as an extension of the soft palate. The frenulum of the tongue here is just this kind of little piece of tissue that attaches the tongue to this lower portion of the oral cavity. So a normal set of teeth or a full set is considered 32 teeth for adults. As I said, there's a few different shapes to our teeth, which allow us to eat a wide variety of foods. Oftentimes, if there is not room for the wisdom teeth to grow in, they will be removed. So those don't do quite as much as the rest of our teeth. We have 20 what are considered primary or deciduous teeth that are really what we use for a majority of our chewing. And then we're going to get into what the actual kind of makeup of a tooth is in terms of the crown and these other parts. So we actually um, form, or our tooth is formed mostly by this material known as dentin. So think dentin, dentist. And then the white portion of our tooth and what's actually showing is covered by enamel, which is the white of our teeth. So enamel is just the outer covering. So the entire tooth is not that white material. It's just the protective, harder covering for the dentin or the bulk of the tooth. Our teeth have kind of a hollow opening in the center known as the pulp cavity, which is filled with pulp. And this pulp in our teeth have the blood vessels, our nerves, and then connective tissue. I know we just talked about alveoli in the respiratory system, but when we're referring to teeth, alveoli mean the little pockets or sockets that our teeth are going to sit into and be held in place. The term dental caries is kind of the medical term for cavities. And what that is a breakdown of that white enamel that covers our teeth. So don't worry about this too much. This is not something that you're going to be responsible for on an exam. But this part you should know. So we have our crown here. That's the part that's above the gum line. The neck is the part of the tooth that's kind of even with the gum line. And then the root is going to be all the way below the gum line set into the alveolar bone or that alveoli or socket. So we have a couple different materials here. Dentin is this orangish material here. That's what makes up a bulk of the tooth. We have enamel that's going to cover the entire crown. That's the white part of the tooth. The cusp is the kind of the tallest portion or the very top of our tooth. And then you'll see this enamel has a thin layer that extends down that we call cementum that helps hold it into place along with our periodontal ligaments. Then before I move on, I'll just show you, this is that pulp in the pulp cavity. So blood vessels and nerves in that cavity make up the pulp. So we said earlier when we talked about the mouth, the palate is the roof of our oral cavity. Hard in the anterior portion, you can feel it with your tongue, has bone. The soft palate is mostly muscle and just connective tissue in the posterior portion. And as I said, the uvula, that little punching bag that hangs down, is an extension of our soft palate. So the salivary glands are what produce saliva, and they're a mixture of serous or water and mucus. Their job is to keep the oral cavity moist. We need that moisture for normal speech so that our tongue and teeth are able to form our sounds and words. It helps dissolve food particles, so it has enzymes in it. So this is where chemical digestion begins, is due to the enzymes in the salivary glands, which are amylase and lipase. So carbs and fats are broken down by saliva. Proteins are not. So we'll talk about that again in a bit. Our saliva also has an enzyme known as a lysozyme, which helps to protect against bacteria, and it breaks down bacteria. And it also begins to neutralize pH. So say we drink lemonade or something on the acidic side of things, it is going to help neutralize that because our bodies are a pretty neutral environment. So we don't want to put something super acidic into it. So we have three different groups of salivary glands. We have the parotid glands. They're just anterior to each ear. Excuse me. Our submandibular glands are going to be just under your jawline. And then your sublingual glands are going to be in the floor of our oral cavity. As I said, saliva is where chemical digestion starts because of the presence of enzymes. So we have amylase, which is going to begin to break down carbohydrates. Lysozyme is what's going to help us fight off the bacteria. Mucin is the mucus portion of the saliva. So we have a serous or watery portion, and then the mucus portion is made up of mucin. One other enzyme that's not listed here is salivary lipase. So lipase stands for lipid enzyme, and so that is going to begin to break down fat. So anytime you see this ASE or zyme enzymes, you know it's going to be an enzyme. So ASE especially gives you a hint that we're talking about an enzyme. Here's just the locations of the salivary glands. You don't necessarily have to know which ones are more watery, which ones have more mucus, but you should know the names of our different groups and just where they're located. The pharynx, we're visiting again from the respiratory system. So remember, that's our throat. It has the naso, oro, and laryngopharynx, 3 different sections to it. And as we're concerned for the digestive system, it's our connection from the mouth to the esophagus. For the digestive system, we go from the oral cavity to the pharynx to the esophagus, and that is going to lead us to the stomach. So our esophagus's job is to get food to the stomach. It joins the stomach at what's known as the cardiac opening, and the lower esophageal sphincter, the LES, is the ring of muscle that controls opening the stomach to allow food in and keeping it closed so that the stomach acid is not backwashing into the esophagus. So that's what heartburn is when we get that regurgitation of gastric juices. Excessive caffeine use, smoking, eating or drinking an excessive amount can contribute to an increase in heartburn. So swallowing has a few phases. This isn't something that you're going to be tested on in depth. We have the voluntary phase at first, when we're actually eating food and we kind of think about beginning to swallow, which is our mouth pushing food into the oropharynx. Once it enters the oropharynx, now we're in the pharyngeal phase, and that's going to be the initiation or triggering of our swallowing reflex. So once our bolus or kind of ball of food gets to a certain point in the oropharynx, it has receptors that are going to say, okay, now it's time to swallow. So that's the involuntary portion of swallowing. And then the esophageal phase is when we're just having food travel down the esophagus to the stomach. And I mentioned this word peristalsis earlier, but that's our term for the wave-like contractions of smooth muscle that are going to move food through the digestive tract. And that's not just for swallowing, that goes for the entire digestive tract. Here's a little bit of a summary slide. I'm not going to go over this again. Like I said, there's nothing major to point out here. This is just kind of a visual of how peristalsis works. So we have this bolus or group of food. And so we have a wave contraction that pushes it forward. And then we have a wave of relaxation so that this bolus can kind of move into the next section of the tract. Our stomach, of course, is located in our abdomen. It's our storage tank for food. It's quite large. It holds up to 2 liters of food. And the stomach has a lot of elastic tissue. So if you expose your stomach to large amounts of food over and over and over again, you can kind of train your stomach to eat large amounts, which isn't necessarily a good thing. The other thing the stomach is important for is the production of its gastric juices. So this includes mucus to help protect it from this hydrochloric acid. And this is also where we introduce enzymes that will begin to break down proteins. So we mentioned that amylase and lipase in the saliva are where carbs and fats begin their chemical digestion, but it's not until the stomach that protein begins being digested. This thick mucus layer is going to help lubricate and protect our epithelial cells. These are on the stomach wall. And so our stomach acid ranges from about 2 to 3 on the pH scale, which is very acidic. So we need this mucus layer to protect our stomach from its own gastric acid. You should know your parts or regions of the stomach. And so it's a little easier to show you once we get down here. I'll zoom in and we'll talk through it. So our muscularis of the stomach has the 3 layers. We have that longitudinal, the circular, and our oblique. And this is to allow that churning action. So we really are mixing and churning food within our stomach. Rugae are large folds, and this is what allows our stomach to stretch. So when it's empty or smaller, then it has those folds. As it expands, those folds stretch out. Chyme is the term that we use for that bolus of food once it begins to get broken down and mixed with our gastric juices. So chyme is what's going to enter our small intestine from the stomach. The pyloric opening is that opening between the stomach and small intestine, and it's controlled via the pyloric sphincter. So anytime you see sphincter, you know it's a thick ring of muscle. And so that's going to regulate how much food is going out into the small intestine. So we don't just drop it all in at once. We kind of slowly open, let some chyme go in, close off, and that allows for more efficient absorption. So we're not overloading our small intestine. So I'm going to zoom in here, guys. So we have our esophagus here. And so this is where that LES, that lower esophageal sphincter is. And so that's going to control food going from esophagus into the stomach. So this is that cardiac opening, this upper part or where the esophagus attaches. We know or term the cardiac part of the heart. I said heart because of cardiac. The cardiac portion of the stomach. So we follow that upper portion of our stomach is the lesser curvature. This top kind of most superior part here is the fundus. And then the main portion we call the body. And as we get down to this end here, before we get to the small intestine, we have the pylorus, which has the pyloric sphincter, and that opens up to our small intestine. This just shows the rugae or folds, so those can expand to allow the stomach to hold more food. And then we have our 3 muscle layers here as well. These gastric pits, this is where our mucus and acid are going to be produced. So they produce these at the bottom and kind of secrete their mucus and acid out into the actual stomach. So as I said, we have hydrochloric acid that's part of that gastric juice. And so it makes our stomach very acidic. That's why we have the mucus to protect the actual cells of our stomach. But that acidic environment, one, helps kill microorganisms. So it's a bit of a defense mechanism, but it also activates the enzyme pepsin, which is how we're going to begin to break down our proteins. We mentioned the mucus of the stomach a couple times there for protection. And then we also secrete this important material known as intrinsic factor. And so we need intrinsic factor to be able to absorb and process vitamin B12. We use vitamin B12 to help synthesize DNA and also produce red blood cells. So super important vitamin. So if our stomach is not secreting intrinsic factor, then we are going to have a deficiency in our B12. So we talked about peristalsis, those waves that move food. Our stomach also has what's known as mixing waves, not quite as strong as the peristaltic waves, and they're there to mix the food and form our chyme. We have both hormonal and neural mechanisms that regulate stomach secretions and movement. So we have a hormone known as ghrelin that is secreted when we are going to feel hungry, and we have a hormone known as leptin that is secreted when we are full. So if the stomach is empty, blood glucose is down, amino acid availability is down, we're going to increase the secretion of ghrelin to tell us that we're hungry. And then when our stomach is getting stretched and full, it's telling us we've had enough food. We're going to secrete leptin to tell us that we are satiated. So about every 4 hours after eating, the stomach is going to actually empty. If you have a really big or kind of really rich meal, high in fat, it's going to take longer, about 6 to 8 hours. So food is introduced. We have our gastric juices. So the mixing waves are going to push the juice in food back and forth to combine it fully to create chyme. And then we're going to have peristaltic waves that are coordinated with an opening of the pyloric sphincter to move just a portion of that chyme into the small intestine. So our small intestine is about 6 meters or 18 feet, almost 20 feet in length if we were to stretch it all the way out. So even though it's the small intestine, it's actually the larger of the two in terms of length. So I said earlier that anytime you hear small intestine, you should think absorption. Anytime you hear absorption, you should think small intestine. And so chyme takes about 3 to 5 hours to pass all the way through our small intestine. And within the small intestine, we're going to introduce some additional enzymes to keep breaking down that food into usable nutrients. Our small intestine also gets some help with secretions to help protect against the acidity of that chyme that's coming from the stomach. So the stomach can handle that pH of 2 with its mucus that it secretes, but the small intestine cannot. So we actually have to introduce some material to help neutralize that chyme. So the small intestine we break into 3 segments. We have the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. So think DJI. The duodenum is our first section, and it's really there primarily to introduce everything together. So it does have some absorptive cells. It has some goblet cells to secrete mucus, granular cells we won't talk about too much. Then it has some endocrine cells that can secrete hormones and enzymes just directly into the system. Most of our small intestine is going to have a cytoskeleton structure known as microvilli. So if you remember back to when we talked about those before, they're like little bumps or hills on the top of our cells, and they're there primarily to help with the absorption process. They create more surface area. The more area we have, the more efficient our absorption can be. Our duodenum is also what is going to get bile from the gallbladder, and it's also going to get some secretions in the form of enzymes and what helps neutralize the chyme from our pancreas. The jejunum is our second portion, and this is where a majority of absorption is going to actually occur now that all the enzymes are introduced to the food or chyme in the duodenum. And then the ileum is our third part, and we don't really talk about it too much. It's just kind of how we get from the small intestine to the large intestine. Here's just an image there. So that stomach opens up into the duodenum via the pyloric opening and sphincter. And then we're going to pass through the jejunum and ileum prior to getting to the cecum. One other thing that I just want to point out while we're kind of first seeing it is this appendix. So the appendix is part of our immune and lymphatic system, but it's actually attached to the cecum or the first portion of our large intestine. Doesn't have a super large role. Most of the time when you hear about the appendix, it's because someone, for whatever reason, got appendicitis and they needed to remove it. But I just wanted to point that out because it is located right here on the large intestine. Okay, here's our four major cell types of the small intestine. Our absorptive cells have their microvilli to increase surface area. They produce the digestive enzymes of the small intestine, and they're going to be what actually absorb that digested food or absorb the nutrients. Goblet cells are going to produce that protective mucus just like the stomach. Our granular cells, we think, help protect our epithelial cells within the small intestine from bacteria. And then our endocrine cells produce regulatory hormones to kind of help decide what we should be doing in the small intestine, or help direct what's going on in the small intestine, I should say. Don't worry too much about this word. It's not going to kind of show up. This is just kind of nice to know information. But our epithelial cells are actually located within these tubular glands known as crypts of Lieberkühn, and these are found at the base of our microvilli. Those granular and endocrine cells end up at the bottom of these glands. And then in the duodenum specifically, we have these mucus glands or duodenal glands, which are going to open up into the base of these other intestinal glands. So this slide, more or less, ignore. In terms of secretions of the small intestine, some of the enzymes that we're concerned with are peptidases, which are going to again be for protein. So we had pepsin in the stomach. Now we have peptidases in the small intestine. And we also have disaccharidases. And so this is going to help continue to break down carbs. So that begins in the mouth, we continue in the stomach, and now in the small intestine, we're going to break disaccharides into monosaccharides, which we can actually absorb. Here's kind of just a zoomed in view of what that microvilli looks like and what is contained in there. So these are the intestinal glands. You can see we have the duodenal gland here that's secreting mucus, and that's how it looks if we were to super zoom in on the small intestine, in this case, the duodenum specifically. Again, we have mixing and propulsion waves, so we're still have those weaker contractions to help mix the chyme with some of the new enzymes and liquids that we're introducing. And then remember, the peristaltic contractions are going to be what actually helps move them across. So in the small intestine, we do not call the mixing waves. Now we call them segmental contractions. So in the stomach, we have mixing waves versus peristaltic waves. In the small intestine, we have segmental contractions versus peristaltic contractions. At the end of our small intestine, we will encounter the ileocecal sphincter. Again, it's a ring of muscle, and this time it's going to control that material moving from the ileum, or the last portion of our small intestine, into the cecum, which is the first portion of the large intestine. This is just kind of showing you the difference between the segmental contraction versus the peristaltic contraction that we looked at in the beginning. So segmental contractions are just how we mix material with enzymes and other material in the small intestine. All right, before we move on to the next part of our digestive tract, we're going to touch on our liver as one of our accessory organs. In the right upper quadrant of our diaphragm, of our abdomen, just under the diaphragm, it consists of right, left, caudate, and quadrate lobes, but you guys really do not need to memorize those. The porta or portal is where our blood vessels, ducts, and nerves are going to enter and exit the liver. And our liver gets a lot of blood flow. It's part of our cleaning system and filtering system. So it's going to receive a lot of blood from the hepatic artery, and then the hepatic portal vein is how we're going to drain that blood back to the heart. So this is what the liver looks like. And so we have a right and a left that's split by the round ligament. And then if we look at the back, we have the quadrate lobe here and the caudate lobe down low. You'll also see the gallbladder is located just on the back portion of the liver. And in terms of our digestive system, when we're talking about the liver, we're concerned with the formation or creation of bile. So hepatocytes or liver cells are going to form this material called bile. The bile is going to funnel to the bile duct to be collected by our gallbladder. So the liver produces bile, the gallbladder stores bile. So the liver is divided into what's known as sections called lobules. There's nothing too much to know about this. This is kind of just nice to know info. They have portal triads, which is going to be a branch of the hepatic artery, the hepatic portal vein, and the hepatic duct for the bile itself. We have hepatic cords that are between kind of the center of each lobule, and our lobules and really the hepatic cords are separated by these really permeable capillaries known as sinusoids. So that's not something that we're going to talk about much because it's not related to our digestive system specifically. So as we said, our liver is producing bile, and it has a hepatic duct to be able to transport that bile out of the liver. So we have a hepatic duct for the right and left side of the liver. Those join together to form the common hepatic duct. And then that forms the cystic duct to drain into the gallbladder. So our common hepatic duct and cystic duct come together to form our common bile duct. So more or less big picture, all you need to know is that the liver is what is producing our bile. The gallbladder is what is storing the bile. So we just talked about the digestive function of our liver. Like I said, it's one of our filters of our blood. So it's going to store and process nutrients. It detoxifies from harmful chemicals, so different medications in the bloodstream, different drugs, different things like alcohol is going to be kind of taken out of the bloodstream by the liver. It helps synthesize new molecules. Some of those can be vitamins, some of those are hormones, and it secretes about 700 milliliters of bile every day. And so we said that the liver secretes bile, but the reason that's kind of relevant to the digestive system is that this bile is going to be what dilutes and neutralizes that chyme that's coming out of the stomach, very acidic. And bile also helps us to break down fats. So the bile release itself is actually controlled by a structure up in the brainstem, one of our cranial nerves, the vagus nerve. This is not something that you guys are going to be tested on, so I'm not going to go into detail on kind of this whole pathway. That's kind of just nice to know that it's actually controlled by more or less kind of a reflex pathway that controls release of bile into the small intestine. Our pancreas sits kind of just behind our stomach in the lower portion of our left upper quadrant. So liver, we said, is right upper quadrant. Pancreas is left upper quadrant. We talk about the two sections of the pancreas being our head and the tail. So our pancreas is a cool gland because it's both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So our endocrine has pancreatic isolates that is going to be the endocrine portion. It's going to secrete insulin and glucagon, and both of those hormones have a role in blood sugar control. So insulin is what is released when blood sugar levels are higher. So insulin drives or causes our body cells to uptake glucose. So glucose is the usable form of sugar. We use glucose in combination with oxygen to create energy in the form of ATP. So think insulin into the cells. So insulin is going to be released when we first have a meal. And so that's going to cause an increase in blood sugar. We'll release the hormone insulin, and that triggers our body cells to actually uptake and utilize that blood sugar. Glucagon is going to be released if blood sugar levels are dropping lower. So glucagon triggers the breakdown of glycogen, which is our stored form of sugar, into glucose again to introduce in the bloodstream. So our liver and our muscles are the primary areas where we have our stores of glycogen. And so we keep extra glycogen on hand. And so when we need to introduce more glucose or an increase in blood sugar to the system, then glucagon will trigger the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. So glucose is the usable form, glycogen is our stored form. Glucose is a monosaccharide, glycogen is a polysaccharide. Our pancreas also has exocrine portion, and that produces some digestive enzymes that we'll talk about, and these are introduced into the duodenum. So remember, endocrine is being secreted directly into the bloodstream. Exocrine is going through a duct to reach its destination. So again, we're introducing some more enzymes to digest proteins. So we have 3 different ones that come from the pancreas: trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase. So all 3 of these are going to break down proteins further. We have a pancreatic version of amylase. So we said the amylase is found in the saliva as well. We also have a pancreatic version of lipase, which is also found in the saliva. A new one that we get from the pancreas is nuclease, or the group of nuclease enzymes, which help break down both DNA and RNA into their nucleotides. So this is a good time to kind of circle back to what we're really trying to break down to as an end goal. So DNA and RNA are nucleic acids. Their building blocks are going to be nucleotides. For proteins, we're trying to break them down into our building blocks of amino acids. We'll talk about those in our next chapter as well. And for carbohydrates, we're trying to break it down into monosaccharides. So remember your building blocks for your major nutrients. So we have our endocrine portion of the pancreas. That's our pancreatic isolate. We have both insulin producing cells and glucagon producing cells. The key here is that that's going directly into the bloodstream. It's an endocrine gland. Then we have our Acini cells, the exocrine portion, that are going to secrete enzymes to the pancreatic duct. So this just shows kind of the relationship between the pancreas and small intestine in the body, and you can see that common bile duct coming in. So remember, in the duodenum, that's where everything is first being introduced and mixed into the small intestine. Again, our vagus nerve, our cranial nerve 10, is what helps to control the release of the different pancreatic juices. So our endocrine and exocrine portion. Like I said, again, we're not going to get into any specific details. You won't be tested on this aspect. Just kind of know that the vagus nerve is what controls this. Okay, so we kind of jumped out of the digestive tract and we're just touching on accessory organs. Now we're back to the large intestine. So this is the next portion of the digestive tract after the small intestine. So besides helping just move the material to its next stop, another major function of our large intestine is to absorb water from our indigestible food, which helps us create more compact feces, and that water we can use by the body can actually use. So our large intestine includes our cecum, the colon. So we go cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and then rectum, anal canal. So the cecum's that first part, that's that ileocecal junction where we join the small and large intestine. And as a reminder, that's where our appendix is attached. Our colon is the longest portion of the large intestine. And as I said, it contains the ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid regions. Our rectum is the tube that begins once our sigmoid colon ends and it finishes with the anal canal. Our anal canal is just the last 2 to 3 centimeters of our digestive tract. By the time our food gets to the large intestine, it's still going to take about another 18 to 24 hours to pass all the way through. Our feces are made up of water, a lot of which is reabsorbed, indigestible food such as fiber, and then other microbes or waste that we want to get rid of. Microbes actually help us to synthesize vitamin K, kind of just another nice to know info there. So the cecum and our ileocecal valve is where small and large intestine join. It goes to the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon. Sigmoid is the end, and then we have the rectum and anal canal. The only other thing to comment on here is in the anal canal, we have both an internal anal sphincter and an external anal sphincter. The internal anal sphincter is controlled by the presence of feces in the rectum. So this internal anal sphincter is involuntary. It's part of our defecation reflex. So the presence of material that is putting pressure on the internal anal sphincter will cause that to involuntarily open up. That smooth muscle, involuntary. Our external anal sphincter is voluntary. It's made of skeletal muscle, and so we can control the external anal sphincter. As I said, we make our feces more compact by absorbing water and other salts that can include sodium, chloride, any of those other ions that we can use in the body. We also secrete mucus to add to the feces at the large intestine, and those microbes or microorganisms are producing waste that contribute to our feces as well. And so our colon's job is to store these feces until we're ready to defecate. And so every 8 to 12 hours, we're going to have these mass movements or strong contractions within the large intestine, which is going to push the contents of the colon towards the anal canal and rectum. Once feces reach that anal canal and rectum, it's going to stimulate the rectal wall to stretch, and that's what stimulates that defecation reflex or the involuntary opening of that internal anal sphincter. So I know that was a lot. Here's a quick kind of summary, kind of bring it back to the big picture. And so this is going to go through the whole digestive process again. And one of the things I want you to think about when you are studying is kind of what organs or what portion of the digestive system is contributing to each step. So we have digestion, which is the chemical and mechanical breakdown of food. That's obviously a lot of different parts of our system. Absorption, remember, a majority is going to occur in the duodenum and especially the jejunum. Some will occur in the stomach and ileum, but when you're thinking absorption, you should think small intestine in these first two sections. Transportation of food through the entire digestive tract, that goes from swallowing all the way through the different areas where peristalsis is occurring. And our end goal is really to take our macronutrients of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins and break them down into their building blocks of monosaccharides. For lipids, we have fatty acids and monoglycerides. And then proteins, our building block here is amino acids. So all of these that we end with, our body can actually absorb and utilize. The macronutrients, when they're in their large form, our bodies really cannot utilize them yet. So we need to actually be able to break them down to make them useful. All right. I know that was a long one, so thanks for hanging with me. And we have just one more chapter on metabolism for this unit.